There is an unwritten rule in professional sports that almost every coach, analyst, and front office executive agrees on without ever needing to say it out loud. You do not hand a rookie the keys in a must-win road game. You do not look at someone in their first professional season with a hostile crowd waiting for them to fail, with a season's worth of public criticism already sitting on their shoulders, and say, "You're making the calls tonight." That is not how professional sports works. Veteran players spend years earning that kind of trust. Entire careers get built around the slow accumulation of credibility that eventually earns a player the right to be the last voice the team listens to when everything is on the line. Coaches protect rookies from that weight, not because they don't believe in them, but because the mental architecture required to manage a live playoff game at full speed while simultaneously reading personnel, calling plays, and absorbing every adjustment the opposition throws at you is something the league generally accepts takes years to develop. And yet, with a playoff series hanging in the balance, in enemy territory against the most physical team in the league, Indiana's coaching staff looked at Caitlin Clark and said exactly that. What happened next didn't just end a Rookie of the Year debate. It exposed something about Clark that 66 out of 67 voters eventually had to acknowledge. Something the turnover counts, the highlight reels, and every sports segment that ran her stats through a blender somehow kept missing entirely. The real story of this season was never in the box score. It was in the decisions being made when the pressure was highest and the margin for error had disappeared completely. If you've been following this series all season, you already suspected the story was bigger than what the numbers were showing. And if you haven't been paying attention, what you're about to hear is going to reframe everything you thought you understood about what Clark actually did this year. Let's go back to before any of this made sense. Before the playoff series, before the award vote, before the debate had a definitive answer. Let's go back to what Caitlin Clark walked into when she entered the WNBA, because without understanding the weight she was carrying from day one, the rest of this story doesn't land the way it should. Arenas that had operated at half capacity for years were selling out weeks in advance. Not because of anything Clark had done professionally. She hadn't played a single WNBA minute yet. The sellouts were happening because of the sheer gravitational force of expectation she imported directly from college. Expectations so enormous they started reshaping the infrastructure of the league before she ever stepped onto a professional court. Television deals were being renegotiated. Broadcast partners were paying attention in ways they hadn't in years. Every building she walked into during that rookie season felt like a finals environment, charged, loud, packed with people who had decided in advance that this was a moment worth showing up for. That kind of environment is a double-edged thing. On one hand, it's validation. It means people believe in what you're doing. On the other hand, it means every mistake gets witnessed by the largest possible audience. Every bad pass, every miscommunication, every moment where the adjustment to professional speed hasn't fully clicked yet, all of it gets dissected in front of a crowd that has already decided you're supposed to be special. There is no quiet room to figure things out in. There is no low-stakes Tuesday night game in a half-empty building where you can work through the kinks without consequence. Clark never got that. From her first professional game, she was under a microscope that most veterans never experience at any point in their careers. And the early weeks did not smooth that transition out. The turnovers started piling up almost immediately, and the number that eventually emerged from the regular season was the kind of figure that sports media finds irresistible. Clark had 42 more turnovers than any other player in the entire league. Not 5 more, not 10 more, 42. That gap was so substantial, so visually jarring when placed next to anyone else's numbers, that it became the dominant storyline almost by default. Sports shows weaponized it immediately. Every bad pass got its own dedicated segment. Every mistake got slowed down, isolated, and replayed with a caption that essentially asked whether the hype surrounding Clark had been manufactured by marketing departments rather than earned on a basketball court. The criticism was loud, consistent, and came from people with real platforms. And if you only looked at that one number, it was hard to argue with the surface-level conclusion.
more turnovers than anyone else in the league by a margin that felt embarrassing. But here's what every single one of those segments missed, and it's not a minor detail, it's the entire point. The turnovers weren't happening because Clark was playing scared. They weren't happening because she was sloppy or unfocused or overwhelmed by the moment. They were happening because she was playing at a speed her teammates were still in the process of calibrating to. The passes being thrown weren't mistakes in conception. They were passes delivered half a second before the play had fully developed, thrown to spaces that Clark had already identified as open before the defender had fully committed to closing them. Sometimes her teammates were ready for it. The ball arrived exactly where it needed to be, and Indiana scored. Sometimes they weren't quite there yet. The timing was slightly off, and the result was a turnover that ended up on a highlight reel with a caption questioning her decision-making.
What nobody paused long enough to point out is that this is exactly what you see in the early stages of any elite point guard's career. The player with the highest basketball IQ on the floor is almost always working slightly ahead of the people around them. That gap in processing speed creates turnovers. It also creates the kind of offense that defenses genuinely can't prepare for, because the decision is happening before the conventional read of the play would suggest it's time to make one. Magic Johnson had turnovers. Steve Nash had turnovers. Every guard who has ever played at a pace that consistently challenged the assumptions of everyone around them has gone through a version of what Clark experienced during that early stretch of her rookie season. If you isolate any elite point guard's first professional year and run their turnover count as the primary lens through which you evaluate their performance, you can build a convincing case against all of them. The turnovers don't tell you what kind of player someone is in any complete sense. What they tell you is the kind of risks that player is willing to take, how far ahead they're reading the game, and how much faith they have in their own vision of what's possible. An athlete who never turns the ball over is often an athlete who never attempts the pass that breaks a defense open. Clark was attempting those passes constantly, even when the timing wasn't there yet. That's not a red flag. That's the entire reason she was worth paying attention to. And the real test of what she was made of wasn't coming in the regular season commentary cycle. It was coming in 4 games against Chicago. Before we get to what Clark did in that playoff series, we need to spend real time on Angel Reese, because this story does not work without her. Anyone telling you the Rookie of the Year debate was already decided before those 4 games even tipped off is rewriting the timeline in a way that isn't honest. The debate was real, it was loud, and Reese is the reason why. Reese came into 2024 as the most physically dominant rookie in the league, and there was no close second. Her presence on the glass was something analysts were openly struggling to contextualize because the numbers she was putting up didn't look like rookie numbers. 12 consecutive double-doubles at one point in the season, a stretch that had the entire basketball world paying attention. A rebounding record that had analysts across the league openly questioning whether the Rookie of the Year conversation even needed to continue at that point, or whether Reese had simply settled the matter through sheer, undeniable production. She wasn't sitting back and waiting for opportunities to come to her. She was manufacturing them, game after game, through a combination of elite athleticism, elite positioning, and a competitive intensity that was impossible to fake and impossible to ignore. The Chicago Sky built their entire organizational identity in 2024 around what Reese and center Camila Cardoso could do together in the paint. They were the best rebounding team in the league, and they had spent the entire season developing a style of play specifically designed to leverage that advantage. Their approach to every game was the same, and it was effective. Be more physical, control the boards, make every possession uncomfortable for the other team, win the war of attrition, and let the paint dominate the perimeter. Against Indiana in particular, that strategy had been working. Every time Indiana tried to establish rhythm, Chicago was right there to disrupt it. Every time Indiana built a cushion, Reese was pulling Chicago back into the game before Indiana could breathe. By the midpoint of the season, several analysts who had started the year in Clark's corner had moved publicly to Reese's, not reluctantly, decisively. The numbers Reese was producing were that hard to argue against. The debate had become one of the genuine storylines of the WNBA season, with legitimate cases being constructed for both players by people who knew what they were talking about.
Anyone claiming otherwise, anyone insisting the outcome was obvious before the playoff series, is being dishonest about what the first half of that season actually looked like. Reese made the debate real. That's the only accurate version of events. Game 1 of the Indiana-Chicago first-round series set a tone that was immediately uncomfortable for anyone expecting a clean Indiana victory. Clark was sharp in certain stretches, crisp passing, accurate shooting from distance, the kind of playmaking that reminded you in isolated moments exactly why the expectations around her had been so enormous coming in. But turnovers kept the door open every time Indiana appeared to be pulling away. It was a one-point game at stages when the margin should have been larger. Indiana survived, but the word survived is doing a lot of work in that sentence. They left Chicago knowing they hadn't solved anything. The physicality Chicago brought to every possession had made itself felt. Every time Clark tried to push the pace, a defender in a black jersey was right there to make it difficult, to slow the game down, to make Indiana feel every inch of the ground they were trying to cover. Indiana won Game 1, but the victory came with an asterisk that read, "This series is far from over."
Game 2 was different in a specific and important way. Clark wasn't forcing the highlight play anymore. She wasn't looking for the pass that would end up on a highlight reel or the shot that would confirm the narrative. She was reading what the defense was offering and making the right play in response. Simple, fundamental, the kind of basketball that doesn't generate individual attention but wins games at a consistent rate. The results were immediate and visible. Teammates who weren't known for big offensive nights suddenly looked like different players. The ball was moving with a rhythm that Chicago's physical scheme had no immediate answer for. Indiana won again. But what stood out to anyone watching closely wasn't the scoreline. It was the quiet, consistent demonstration of basketball intelligence that was happening underneath all the noise. For a rookie who had spent months being publicly criticized for poor decision-making, it was a statement that didn't need to announce itself. The decisions Clark was making in Game 2 were simply better decisions, and they showed up in the result. The series was 2-0 for Indiana, but nobody was relaxing because Game 3 was coming, and Game 3 was going to change everything. Game 3 matters more than any single game in this entire story, not because of how it started, but because of what happened in the final minutes and because of what Indiana learned from the collapse that came out of nowhere and nearly cost them the series. Indiana built a 15-point lead in the fourth quarter, 15 points in a playoff game, with the series already going in their direction. The game looked finished. Any reasonable observer watching that game at that point in the fourth quarter would have told you Indiana was advancing. The margin was too large, the time was too short, and Indiana had been the better team through most of the game. Except that's not how it ended. Chicago, led by Angel Reese doing things in that building that will be studied for years, began dismantling the lead piece by piece. Reese finished with 25 points and 16 rebounds in that game. Not just statistics, a performance. The kind of performance where you can feel a player deciding the game isn't over and then imposing that decision on everyone else in the building. Chicago went on a run that had no business happening given the score and the circumstances. Indiana had no answer for Reese in those final minutes. Nothing they tried slowed her down. Nothing they tried stopped the bleeding. With 30 seconds left, Indiana still had a chance to win. The final play didn't connect. Chicago won the game and cut the series to 2-1. The collapse didn't happen randomly. Indiana's coach identified the cause directly in the postgame. They stopped playing fast. They abandoned the pace and spacing that had been generating advantages all game long. They got cautious with a lead, started protecting the margin instead of attacking, stopped trusting the style of play that had put them in that position. And Chicago, a team that had been waiting with extraordinary patience for exactly that kind of opening, walked right through the door Indiana held open for them. The identity of that Indiana team was simple and specific. When they played fast, moved the ball, and trusted each other, they were nearly impossible to stop.
The moment they abandoned that in favor of a more conservative approach, the advantage evaporated, and they nearly paid for it with an elimination-level collapse in a game they should have won by double digits. The lesson from Game 3 was direct and painful. There was no way to misread it. And what Indiana's coaching staff decided to do with that lesson going into Game 4 is the part of this story that the broader conversation has consistently underestimated. Going into Game 4, Indiana was in a position that required complete clarity about who they were and how they needed to play. The series lead was still theirs, 2-1, but the psychological momentum had shifted. Chicago had just demonstrated that no lead was safe, that Reese was capable of taking over games in ways that made conventional defensive planning feel pointless, and that the moment Indiana stopped being aggressive, they became vulnerable in ways that their talent advantage couldn't automatically overcome. The coaching staff had a decision to make about how to respond, and the decision they made is extraordinary when you sit with it long enough to appreciate what it actually required. They told Clark to run the offense, not just to execute the plays that came in from the sideline, not just to be the conduit between the coaching staff and the court, but to be the one calling plays, reading the defense, and making real-time decisions about how Indiana was going to attack. Her coach put it plainly afterward, "The crowd is too loud in Chicago for me to communicate every call from the sideline. You need to be the one making the decisions out there." That explanation sounds simple and logistical on the surface, but what it represents in practice is something far more significant. In a must-win road game against the most physical team in the league, in a building that had just watched their team blow a 15-point lead 3 days earlier, Indiana's coaching staff sat down with their first-year player and said, "We trust you more than we trust the traditional structure."
Think about what that requires from the coaching staff's perspective. Not just confidence in Clark's basketball IQ, though that's obviously part of it, but a willingness to put the outcome of an entire series in the hands of someone who has never been through this before. Most veterans would feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on them. Most experienced players would be running mental checklists during warm-ups, second-guessing their reads, wondering whether they're interpreting the defense correctly in the moments when the decision needs to happen without deliberation. Rookies aren't supposed to be able to carry that. The conventional wisdom says the mental processing load is simply too high for someone without professional experience to manage in a high-stakes environment. Clark was 22 years old. She had been in the WNBA for 1 season. She had 42 more turnovers than anyone else in the league. And the coaching staff looked at all of that and decided she was the person they trusted most to make the right calls when the game was real and the crowd was hostile and there was no margin for hesitation. That decision alone, regardless of what happened next, tells you more about what Indiana's entire organization actually believed Clark was capable of than any number from any regular season stat sheet. The vote they cast in that pregame meeting was as significant as the 66-1 vote that came later, just expressed in a different language. Chicago came out aggressive in Game 4 in a way that immediately felt like a test of whether Indiana had absorbed the lesson from Game 3 or was going to repeat the same mistakes in a different setting. Lindsey Allen, their guard, was on fire from the opening minutes. Back-to-back baskets in the opening stretch. Chicago dictating pace, forcing Indiana into early timeouts, controlling the energy of the building before Indiana had a chance to establish anything. For a moment, it looked exactly like the beginning of Game 3, the kind of start where a team either finds its footing immediately or starts a slow, visible slide toward losing the game before the first quarter ends. The crowd was into it. Chicago had everything working in their favor. Home court, momentum from the Game 3 comeback, a genuine belief that they had figured out how to take Indiana apart. Indiana found their footing. And once they did, Clark started doing something that gradually and then decisively changed the entire complexion of what everyone in that building was watching. She wasn't running a predetermined script. She wasn't waiting for plays to come in from the sideline and then executing them mechanically.
She was reading in real time who needed the ball, where the defense had left itself exposed, which action would punish the specific scheme Chicago had set up in that possession. It was happening fast, and it was happening correctly. The decisions she was making weren't the decisions of someone working through a process. They were the decisions of someone who had already finished the process before the play had even fully unfolded. Someone who was operating a full step ahead of the defense in a way that defenses find almost impossible to prepare for, because the preparation requires anticipating choices that haven't been made yet. Her pick-and-roll execution with Aaliyah Boston became effectively unstoppable by the time the second half arrived. Chicago tried every coverage adjustment available to them across the course of the game. They switched, they hedged, they doubled, they went under. Nothing worked at a consistent level. The timing between Clark and Boston had developed into something that transcended the technical. When two players develop the kind of chemistry where the decision is already happening before the play has fully materialized, before the coverage has fully committed, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to defend, because you can't guard a decision that was made before you knew you needed to respond to it. Chicago's defenders were consistently a fraction of a beat late, and in basketball, a fraction of a beat is the entire game. The lead grew. Not dramatically, not in huge swings that got the crowd on Indiana's side immediately, but steadily, possession after possession, Clark and her teammates adding to the margin with a relentless consistency that was in some ways harder to watch from Chicago's bench than a dramatic run would have been. A dramatic run gives you something to respond to emotionally. Steady, methodical, patient basketball just grinds a team down in a way that doesn't have a clean emotional response. Chicago kept fighting. Every time they got close enough that the building started believing again, Indiana had a response ready. The ball was moving, the bench was locked in, and the crowd in that Chicago arena, even with their own team in front of them, began registering something that arenas always eventually register when one team has genuinely broken the other. There is a specific feeling that develops in an arena when a game has actually been decided, even when the scoreboard hasn't fully caught up with the reality on the floor yet. The team that's losing starts playing differently. The movements get tighter. The decision-making becomes more isolated, less connected to what the team is doing as a whole. Players start trying to make individual plays to manufacture momentum rather than trusting the collective. You can see it in their body language between possessions, in the way they set up on defense with a posture that's slightly different from the posture of a team that believes the game is still genuinely open. Chicago started showing all of those signs with several minutes still remaining. The score might still have looked competitive on the broadcast, but anyone watching closely could see that the game had already been settled in every meaningful sense. Indiana wasn't just winning, they had broken Chicago's belief that the outcome was reversible. And once a team loses that belief, the final minutes become a formality.
By the time the fourth quarter was fully underway, Indiana was up by 11 and continued adding to it, the largest lead of the entire series. A margin that, given what had happened in Game 3 just 72 hours earlier, felt almost impossible. Chicago got frustrated as the gap widened and stayed wide. The physicality escalated in that way it sometimes does when one team realizes the game is slipping away and runs out of legitimate basketball responses. A foul on Clark that had no legitimate basketball justification drew flags and replays across every broadcast covering the game. Clark walked away from it without a word, not a complaint, not a gesture toward the officials, not a single second of reaction that gave Chicago anything to feed off of. She kept executing. That detail matters more than it might seem. In Game 3, Indiana had let Chicago's physicality get into their decision-making. The fouls and the rough play had affected the way Indiana was thinking about their possessions, introduced hesitation where there had been confidence, and contributed directly to the collapse that had nearly ended their season. In Game 4, Clark had simply decided that nothing Chicago did on that floor was going to reach her. Not the hard fouls, not the hostile crowd, not the residue of the Game 3 collapse that was sitting in the background of everything that happened in Game 4.
She had already determined how the game was going to end, and nothing in that building was in a position to renegotiate that determination. 6 three-pointers by the time she was done. She exited the game with time still on the clock because Indiana's lead had grown to the point where her continued presence was unnecessary. And the building, Chicago's building, in enemy territory in a playoff elimination game, gave her a standing ovation on the way to the bench. Final score, Indiana 100, Chicago 81. Series, Indiana 3, Chicago 1. Clark had done exactly what her coaching staff had trusted her to do, and she had done it in the loudest, most unforgiving room available to her. When the Rookie of the Year vote was announced, Clark received 66 of 67 ballots. The single dissenting vote went to Angel Reese, cast by the one analyst who had remained consistent throughout the entire season in their assessment of what Reese's production represented. Everyone else had moved. One analyst, who had publicly and confidently argued Reese's case at the season's midpoint, walked back his position after the playoff series ended, reaching for an analogy that acknowledged what had become undeniable. He compared Reese to Dennis Rodman and Clark to Michael Jordan. Not a perfect comparison by any stretch. The specifics don't map cleanly, but the underlying point was clear, and it was important. Reese's contributions in 2024 were historic on their own terms, extraordinary individual production that deserved every bit of recognition it received, and Clark's impact on the game, on her team, on the entire level of attention and revenue and interest the league was experiencing, operated on a tier that was simply different in kind, not just in degree. But here's the thing about the 66-1 margin. It captures the outcome. It doesn't capture what the outcome cost. It doesn't tell you what it actually took to get there. Numbers have a way of making things look cleaner than they were, more inevitable than they felt in the middle of them, and the Rookie of the Year vote is no exception. The final number looks authoritative, 66 out of 67. But the story behind that number is considerably messier and considerably more human than a vote count suggests. It doesn't tell you about the 42 turnover narrative that Clark had to carry through an entire professional season, while still delivering at the highest level when the games that mattered most arrived. Every single one of those turnovers got its own media cycle. Every single one contributed to a public conversation that consistently questioned whether she belonged at this level, whether the expectations were justified, whether the thing everyone had been sold about Caitlin Clark was real or a product. She absorbed all of that while still playing her game. She didn't adjust her style to protect her statistics. She didn't start making the safe pass to manage her turnover count and her public image simultaneously. She kept playing at the speed she believed in, even when the cost of that belief was showing up on highlight reels as evidence against her. It doesn't tell you about the physical escalation that intensified as the season went on. As Clark became more visible, as the stakes around her performances grew larger, as opposing teams recognized that disrupting her rhythm was worth more than conventional defensive positioning, the physicality directed at her increased. Plays that would have drawn immediate whistles in other contexts were allowed to continue. The targeting was visible and it was consistent, and it was part of every single game Clark played from roughly mid-season onward. She navigated that without once making it publicly about herself, without once using a microphone as an opportunity to build a victim narrative that would have been easy to construct and effective in generating sympathy. She just kept playing. It doesn't tell you about what it costs to be the most scrutinized player in a professional sports league for an entire season. Every decision Clark made was analyzed. Every mistake was distributed across every platform that covers the sport. In that kind of environment, the pull towards self-protection is enormous. The instinct to manage your image, to take the safe play, to avoid the risk that might generate the next critical headline, is not a character flaw. It's a human response to extraordinary pressure. Clark never appeared to operate from that instinct. She kept playing the game she believed in, kept taking the risks she believed were correct, and kept pointing the camera back toward the team every time a microphone was placed in front of her. When you're the most talked about player in the league and the media is essentially handing you opportunities to take credit on a continuous basis, choosing repeatedly not to take that credit is not a small thing. It's a consistent, deliberate choice that speaks to something about character that statistics genuinely cannot measure.
Angel Reese was and remains a special player. This needs to be said clearly and without qualification, because the outcome of the ROI vote does not diminish what she did in 2024, and anyone treating it as though it does is misreading the story. Her season was remarkable by any honest standard. The double-doubles, the rebounding records, the relentless physical dominance she brought to every game she played, the competitive intensity that made Chicago a genuinely difficult team to face regardless of the circumstances. None of it disappears because Clark won the award. The final vote count doesn't erase anything Reese accomplished. It just places both performances next to each other and acknowledges that one had a different kind of impact on the league. Two players can both be exceptional in the same season. The Rookie of the Year debate in 2024 was real because Reese made it real, because her production was the kind of production that demands serious engagement rather than dismissal. The analysts who moved to her side weren't wrong to see what they were seeing. They were responding honestly to genuine historic numbers. The debate happened at the level it did because both players were doing things that were genuinely difficult to evaluate in the same framework. Reese was transforming games through physical dominance. Clark was transforming games through playmaking and basketball intelligence and an almost gravitational effect on everyone around her. Those aren't easy things to weigh against each other. The vote that came out was a reflection of what eventually became undeniable, but the difficulty of the question along the way was real and it was legitimate. The larger story, the one that makes all of this worth following beyond the award season, is what comes next. Because both of them return, both of them come back next season carrying a full year of professional experience, a deep familiarity with each other's games, a competitive history with genuine stakes embedded in it, and a fan base that has now seen enough to understand exactly what it's watching. The first chapter of this rivalry produced basketball that elevated the entire league, filled arenas that had been half empty for years, generated broadcast interest that hadn't existed in the WNBA in a long time, and ended with a playoff series that will be studied and discussed for years. If the first chapter produced all of that, the second chapter, with both players more developed, more experienced, and with more to prove, represents something the league genuinely hasn't had in a long time. A rivalry that doesn't need to be manufactured. A storyline that writes itself because the players are real and the competition between them is real, and the question of where it ends genuinely doesn't have an answer yet. The debate about the 2024 Rookie of the Year ended the moment the Chicago crowd stood up for a player on the opposing team in a playoff elimination game. That moment captured something that box scores and vote counts and highlight reels never quite managed to capture. It captured the feeling of watching someone do something in a context designed to make it impossible, and doing it in a way that earns respect even from the people rooting against them. That's the thing about greatness that reveals itself in impossible situations. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for the noise to quiet down. It just keeps making the right decisions until the only thing anyone can do is acknowledge what they're watching. 66 out of 67 voters eventually did. The one holdout cast their vote for a player who also deserved to win. And the story, the real story, is only getting started.